Okay, good afternoon, friends. It's a real pleasure and a great honor for me at the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy to welcome all of you. And today is the first in the series of webinars that we're going to be doing on urban labor rights and state response in times of COVID. This is the first such thing. Then we're going to be having a session on affordable housing. But first of all, let me also mention that, this is a collaborative effort between EMDA, between the Institute of Local Self-Government and the Academy, and of course, the Institute of Human Settlements. And today we have with us three very prominent speakers, in addition to Gautam and Vidya, who's going to be also a panelist. So let me first of all welcome Professor Dr. Ravi Srivastava. The very eminent scholar has spent long innings in JNU on urban settlements, heads the economic entrepreneurship units for Uttarakhand and UP, is now working at the IHS. So welcome, sir, and we look forward to hearing from you and to share your experiences and thoughts. And he has very important seminal thoughts on the subject. A great pleasure in welcoming Mathivanan, who's a fine example of what an administrative officer should be, in terms of not just thinking, but actually doing, because a lot of people have ideas, but the task of putting those ideas into action is certainly something which he has shown. So welcome to the panel. It's a great pleasure for us to have you with us. And let me also welcome Divya Verma, who's a graduate from IRMA, then went to Harvard, and has now consciously decided to work in a sector which is so crucial for all of us: livelihoods, migration, and looking at vulnerabilities. And not just looking at these issues, but also trying to project possible solutions. Because I think all of us are and occupy the space where we do not think that our job is only to criticize. We think that our job is to get an intelligent understanding of why things are the way they are, and within the format of the government policy, how can we tweak those policies? How can we nudge the principal actors into a situation which makes it a more positive circle for all concerned? And I'm very happy that today, while I was discussing all this, I had a conversation with Shailesh Pathak, who gave me a little note which he had written about 4 years ago on how we can sort of look at urban shelters. I mean, a market-based concept of Ryan Becerra, which I've given to Vidya. So he'll also be, making a presentation for about 5-7 minutes on that. So without much ado, the issues that we'll be taking up today, which the panel members will be taking up today, will be issues which the urban migrant community faces, issues about ration cards, portability, about childcare, about health, education, water, sanitation, and the fact that, many of them do not have rights, and therefore they can be thrown out of wherever they're living. And we've also seen that between March to June, we've seen the biggest urban exodus. So what are the rights to the city which an urban migrant worker would have? And how do we go about these things? So while we go on for all these questions, let me begin by, first of all, asking Mathivanan to tell us about the wonderful experience. I wouldn't use the word wonderful experience, but I would say the initiative which the government of Odisha took to address this issue. Because the fact remains that amongst the migrant workers, I mean, Odisha and Bengal and the eastern region is the area from where most of the migrant workers have come from. So how did you address this issue? We'll listen to you, then we'll talk to Divya, then we'll ask Professor Ravi Srivastava, and then I'll come over to Vidya. So over to you, Mathivanan.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for the opportunity.
You have about 8 to 10 minutes for your presentation.
Yes, sir. Thanks for the opportunity, sir. Yes, sir said that it was a wonderful experience, but it was very intense experience for us, sir. Very intense, and in a very short period of time. Not only that, Odisha, once the lockdown was in place, about 20 lakh people became jobless. The people who were working in the informal sectors, unorganized workers, laborers, they suddenly became jobless and lost their livelihood, daily earnings. Not only that, we also received lots of in-migrants from Surat, from Ahmedabad, from Maharashtra, from southern India. So that large-scale influx also happened. And how did we, as sir said, that they have rights. What kind of rights they have? Right to live, right to livelihood, right to earning. So how do we meet those challenges? Sir, I have a brief presentation for about 5 minutes. If sir permits, I can do
Sure,
that.
please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So, sir, the lockdown happened on March 23rd. Lots of migrants started coming, and we also had the lockdown created a job loss for more than 20 lakh urban poor. So we thought about how do we provide immediate wage employment opportunities to them. We do not have a counterpart of NREGA, and NREGA also was not in operation at that time, even in the rural areas. So our response came immediately in April 2020. We came up with a scheme called Urban Wage Employment Initiative, and that is meant for the providing the temporary employment opportunities for a period of 6 months to be implemented in the entire state, covering all the municipal bodies. And 100 crore we have earmarked. We have not gone back. We have not gone to the finance department. Within the available budget, we located 100 crore, and then we said that this is the utmost, this is the immediate requirement. If fund is not available for this, then it's not available for any other purpose. So we made a scheme. We didn't have the scheme earlier. This is the first time we have come up with this kind of wage employment program. And we thought that the work should be very small works, and the community partnership should be very intense in that. Community should be rather executing this. So we operated at the ward level, not at the municipal body level. Ward level, we formed the committees involving the women self-help group and other prominent people like Anganwadi worker and Asha, and the local corporator or the local official was heading it. That committee prepared the projects. The green color indicates where the community active participation is there. So that ward level committee came up with the projects that can be taken up in that locality. What is required, what kind of works that can be taken up. Then the local engineer in charge of that particular area prepared the technical feasibility, and then it was placed before the urban level committee, the committee headed by the corporate commissioner. And then that committee approves the work immediately, and then they also select the implementing partner. If the work value is less than 1 lakh, then we proposed that the work should be awarded to the community institutions like women self-help group, or if the work is executed in a slum area, then the slum dweller association should be given the work order. Slum dweller association, which we have formed under another program, slum land rights program we are implementing. It's a flagship program. Under that program, we have formed a slum dweller association in all the slums, 2,919 slums in the state. So slum dweller association have become partner with the municipalities in executing this work. Work order is issued to them. Then they procure the material, or the municipality procure the material. If it is more than 1 lakh, then the concerned JE is given the work order. But the slum dweller association or the women self-help group is taken on board as an implementing partner. They will have a supervising responsibility. The workers are to be mobilized by the community, these implementing partner. They have a role, and they are paid for it. 7.5% of the estimated cost is paid to the self-help group or the slum dweller association as supervision charges, which otherwise we would have paid to a contractor. So then they are issued the muster roll by the local engineer, and they are supposed to maintain their muster roll. They have to do the entry of how many people are working and their account number, all those things. And then on weekly basis, their wages are paid, and it is a direct benefit transfer, account transfer only. And once the project is completed, then the engineer has to certificate, so the work is completed. See, these are the meetings of the slum dweller association or the self-help group, and they are paid 7.5% of the total project cost as the supervision charges to encourage the self-help group to invest their time, take active part in that. Slum dweller association. This is a way of making the institutions also grow, strengthening the institutions. What kind of works that can be taken up under this initiative? The open space development, park development, micro activity, that this is the micro community center, small community center, which can act as a micro activity center, a work center, or a meeting hall. It's a multi-purpose center. Rainwater harvesting, since we were preparing for receiving the monsoon, rainwater harvesting structure, plantation work, stormwater drainage, constructing new or maintaining the existing one, repair of the existing damaged structures, or in the urban areas, beautification also has been done. Wall painting, extensive wall painting has been done, especially with the awareness messages like awareness on sanitation, awareness on corona, all those things. See, the impact is that in all 24 wards, we formed the committees, meetings conducted, they prepared projects. 8,733 projects have been finalized by all these in all the urban local bodies. Out of it, 104, we earmarked 100 crore, but they have slightly exceeded. 104 crore has been the estimated cost of these projects, out of which 56.76 crore is the total wage component, and 27 lakh wages are to be created. And we have taken only labor intensive work. And this program does not involve any contractor. It's a contractor-free program. The community institutions are necessary part of this. They have to be. Either they are the direct implementing partner, work order is issued in their name. If the work value is less than 1 lakh, if it is more than 1 lakh, they are implementing partner and they are paid the in-supervision charges. Then the works are monsoon preparedness also, that activities also have been taken up. And work order to Women Self-Help Group and Slum Dweller Association have been issued for the first time. They are given work orders as executants. That means we are graduating them to a small time contractors, and the payment is strictly through the online system. And these are some of the, sir, and by this process we have moved the governance to the 4th tier. That means our Slum Dweller Association and the women self-help groups have become a governing institution below the municipal councils. And they had a very active role in identifying the project, executing the project, and then engaging the laborer and making the payment also. And it has been 6 months for us. It has given a very good, rich experience. We have learnt a lot from executing this program. And now we are thinking of, moving to an area where the urban wage employment initiative will become our daily norm. Not only that it was for a 6 months period, we are planning to continue this mode of execution for these kind of small works. Community partnership will become a norm. This also helps in strengthening the community institutions, empowering them, also financially empowering them. And this, in my opinion, will be the blueprint for a future urban Manrega program. And this also will provide works code for all the community partnership initiatives in the urban areas. How community partnership programs can be implemented. What would be the roles and responsibilities of various stakeholders involved in this? What is the role of the council? What is the role of the JE? What is the role of the self-help group? All those things are laid out in that. It completely eliminates the profit motive. And this also, since the self-help groups, slum dwellers are involved right from beginning, the assets after creation also will be transferred to them for future maintenance. That's what we are doing. And this process has completely broken the nexus between the contractors and the officials and other vested interest in the system. These are some of the works taken up in the last 6 months. You would be happy to know that more than 500 micro activity centers, that is the multi-purpose community centers, have come up in the slum areas and other areas. They are all constructed by the beneficiaries themselves, and they are managing it. And these are the photographs showing the rainwater harvesting structures, pond renovation, water body renovation, construction of stormwater drain. These are the open space development in the slum areas, where the play areas have been created adjoining to the micro activity center. This has become the now hub of the community now. The hub, the community converges in the evening hours. They have their functions, they have their celebrations here. These are the plantation projects once the monsoon started. And these are the wall paintings taken up by mostly by the local artists, and the women self-help group also have been involved in these wall painting activities. So they have been trained in this. Now over a period of time, our women self-help group members will become painters. So these are the corona awareness messages, sanitation awareness messages painted recently by them with this initiative. This is the median plantation taken up by the local self-help groups. So these are the activities. It has given a great experience for us, and we are graduating to the next level of urban Narega. We are thinking of that, sir.
Very good. Excellent.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, I wish you could have gone on longer, but there are constraints of time. So I think the key message here is community participation. Key message here is community participation, and not just community participation, it is trust of the community. which is sometimes missing in a lot of the interventions that we do. So it is not just a dole, it is a empowerment process. So thank you very much, and we hope that many more states and many more districts will look up to this project. Okay, Divya, in this scenario, how do you see the responsibility of employers? How do you see the role of civil society? And how do you see, I mean, other than the government, how do you see the other stakeholders, playing their role in this crisis? Your thoughts and views on the subject.
Sure. Thank you, sir. So just to kind of introduce and share a few opening remarks, and then I will go on to answer your question also. So I represent Ajivika Bureau, and we are an organization that has been working with migrant workers for the past 15 years or so. So in the beginning, I just want to focus a little bit on this community of seasonal circular migrants who underwent, of course, an entire distress in the event of the lockdown, and then move on to some of the exclusionary kind of experiences that they've had in the urban areas in the course of our work that we've seen. So a lot of migrant workers, seasonal migrant workers, move from their villages to the cities. This movement could be short-term, long-term, short or long distance, single or family-based, and they work predominantly in the informal sector, in sectors such as construction, domestic work, manufacturing, and recycling. They of course come from very historically kind of marginalized communities like SCs and STs, and so migration really just adds another dimension of vulnerability to their lives. I think one important kind of dimension that we need to keep in mind when we think about urban migrant workers and their inclusion into our urban policies is the whole mobility and multi-locality of their lives, because they move between the villages and the cities, between one work site to another, from one destination to another, crossing state boundaries, sometimes traversing the length and breadth of the country, moving along with their contractors. So they really lead kind of multi-local lives, investing both in the cities as well as in the villages. So this is some characteristics of migrant workers that kind of differentiates them from the vast kind of urban umbrella of urban poor. There are of course many vulnerabilities that they face, but a lot of them were systemic, long-standing, pre-existing issues that got accentuated because of the lockdown. So we recently, Ajivika Bureau conducted a study in the cities of Ahmedabad and Surat, and I just want to spend some time highlighting some of the important findings of the study. So the report was called "Unlocking the Urban: Reimagining Migrant Lives in Cities Post COVID-19." And this study was conducted across the cities of Ahmedabad and Surat, which are really kind of migrant hotspots that Sir also just talked about in his presentation before. So one of the big kind of structural issues, of course, is the sedentary bias in our policies, which means that one has to repeatedly prove domicile again and again to access basic urban public provisioning. So in our study, for example, we found that more than 95% of the migrant workers surveyed had no ration cards in the destination. For example, ASHA and Anganwadi workers, we found that their incentives were very misaligned, to the needs and lives, nature of lives undertaken by this community. For example, they are incentivized based on continuously vaccinating a pregnant woman or a child. But migrants, of course, lead very transient lives, so there's no real incentive for frontline workers to address their needs. We also found that in housing schemes, schemes such as the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, really because of an inability to prove their domicile, migrants are not able to even apply for such schemes. And some policy documents even actively caution against allotting housing units to migrant workers. In the case of health, though primary healthcare is available on a universal basis, we found that in order to access tertiary healthcare, that is again, dependent on domicile. Also, I want to highlight, some of the housing arrangements in these urban areas that specifically the seasonal circular migrant populations actually experience, and how that affects their access to urban schemes. So we found that migrants live predominantly in open spaces in the peripheries of the city, which may or may not be within the purview of the municipal corporations. So these may be on open public lands, near railway tracks, under flyovers. Again, another second mode of living arrangement, is that they live within their work sites, within very precarious kind of manufacturing units, small recycling units, construction sites, in hotels and dhabas that they work in. And the third one was, of course, within congested kind of slum areas, or in mess halls. For example, in Surat, most of the Odia workers, the Parloom workers, will live in large kind of mess halls. And we can imagine the kind of implications that these kinds of housing arrangements have in the current scenario, when there is such a public health emergency and lots of migrant workers are coming back to the cities. And one of the implications of this is that there is, of course, no enumeration at any level in the administration, either by the census or the NSSO, or even at a state or city level, of their, or recognition of their settlements. So which means that they really completely get excluded from the purview of urban planning with respect to infrastructure for water or sanitation, or services by health and ASHA, Anganwadi workers. And a broader kind of point that I want to make is that we found through our study that migrant communities are largely, outside the imagination of urban development policies and planning processes. So their logics of livelihood or survival, their whole mobility and multi-locality, these are not really factored into the policy imagination of our urban development schemes, because our urban development schemes are largely based on the premise that the poor would want to settle, the migrants or anybody who comes to the city would want to settle down in a city, and the way to access urban entitlements is to build incremental claims to the city, and that's a way of claim making to the public entitlements. But really the lives that migrant workers lead do not really fit into this imagination or this logic of the policy making institutions or the governance frameworks, which means that in the current scenario, our migrants have very arbitrary kind of access to public provisioning, both with respect to quality and with respect to the costs that they have to pay to access, for example, water or sanitation. They have to negotiate on and on with, informal kind of actors. For example, the watchman in apartment nearby, or the security guard of a park from where they can go and access a water stand post. And of course, lack of voting rights in the city really means that they really don't have any political leverage to influence their corporators or other kind of political actors. There's of course also widespread kind of ethnic caste and class-based stigmatization that they experience. So these were some of the broad range of issues that I wanted to highlight. Again, this survey was conducted pre-COVID, and we feel that these were some of the systemic underlying kind of factors that really kind of compounded the crisis for workers during the lockdown. And just to spend a few minutes on the way forward before I close. So I think that, going forward, because there is such a spotlight now on the crisis faced by migrants, and we must leverage on this situation. And like Sir was saying in the beginning, how do we kind of work together, different stakeholders, how do we work together to kind of, civil society, employers, and the government, how can we come together to work towards advancing their interests? So I think first and foremost, India's policy imagination needs to recognize migrants as a legitimate presence in the cities that are in need of, critical public services. So both through portability and enabling universalization, really going beyond portability, but universalizing access to public services, I think will be really critical. Enumeration and recognition of their settlements, so that we have numbers regarding the magnitude of the issue, regarding the flow of the issue. That will be a critical, I think, first step. And just to conclude with the Sir raised earlier. So what is the responsibility of the industry and the civil society organization? So I think industry also definitely has to assume responsibility, and it should not just be left to the state to really figure out how to address the plight, because right now the situation that we see is that the value chains are really so fragmented, and migrant workers of course work at the very, very bottom end. So they work in very, very precarious kind of work settings or units that contribute to big brands at the end of it. So big kind of capital owners, the industrial establishments should also assume responsibility for the work conditions of workers. Principal employers should be held responsible. Right now, the situation is that because there are so many contractors and middlemen in the value chains in the informal kind of sector, a lot of responsibility is just placed on the contractor, who himself or herself is not a very empowered player. So there should be transparency in the value chains, and employers and industry must take the responsibility. I think civil society, on the other hand, should also, I think, come forward to really, so there are a lot of, I think, civil society organizations also work across urban and rural kind of territories, and many of them operate in silos, but nobody really pays attention to this community in between that is in a state of drift between the rural and the urban continuum. So I think paying attention to the needs of this vulnerable population who's not very easy to access at all, who lives within the work sites, lead very invisible lives, and enabling that kind of frontline access, direct access, last mile access to services, I think that would be really helpful. Yeah, I would stop now and then look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Divya. I think what you've brought out is the aspect of invisibility. I think the core point that comes out from your very pithy presentation is that, look, this is a group which is there. It is invisible, one, because the work which they're doing is informal. And number two, the communities where they come from are mostly marginalized, would be predominantly scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, Banjaras, and people who are already being discriminated against in the villages also. And if there was no such discrimination in the village, if they had assets in the village, I mean, the likelihood of their coming and joining the informal urban workforce is not going to be all that much. In fact, just to use the term anecdotally, I mean, for instance, the more prosperous people from Punjab would become taxi drivers in Delhi because they had the base of taxis at least. So they were not really, they were therefore different from those who were not even that endowed. So there are layers and layers and layers. So thank you for bringing this point out and for raising the aspect of invisibility. I'll now be requesting Professor Ravi Srivastava, who's the the most senior person amongst us. How do you see the role of the urban governance structures in this? Especially after the 74th Amendment, I mean, what is the responsibility of the mayor? What is the responsibility of the development authority? What is the responsibility of an elected councillor? And where do these borderlines cross between the state government and the municipal corporation? So somebody has to be held accountable for this. So your thoughts on the subject, Professor Srivastava.
Thank you very much. Am I visible? Sorry?
Before you start, I will just say for the participants that you should use the question and answer box for sending any questions that you might have that we will be taking up after the panelists have spoken. Use the Q&A box for sending your questions. We'll be addressing them. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Okay. I hope I'm audible to you.
Yes, sir. You're both audible and visible.
Okay. Okay, but I can only see you just now. So, I am going to thanks for two excellent presentations on the Odisha Urban Employment Assurance Program, and then Divya's own presentation based on the study also which they've done. And Divya's Ajivika Bureau is also a huge practitioner, long-standing practitioner in working with migrants. I'll be stepping a little bit back, before I come to your question, and looking at the broad sort of rural-urban interconnection. Let me just share my screen in a short presentation with you in order to be able to do that. Yeah. Okay. So just to begin by saying that I realize that I'm probably addressing the majority of people whom I'm addressing are in the urban governance structure and implementers, and that urban and rural are distinguished by distinct structures of governance. But I do want to point out that there are very close spatial, demographic, economic and sociological interconnections which blur this distinction. And we often use terms like urban outgrowth, periphery, agglomeration, urban villages, and so on to designate part of this. The demographic interconnections are very important, and they're basically through migration of permanent migrants or temporary populations, which take the form of either commuting, long-term circulation, or short-term seasonal circulation, which is what basically Divya focused on. And I'm going to be concerned here mainly with those urban migrants who are engaged in the urban informal economy, either as self-employed people or the wage-employed people. In a sense, they're informal workers with precarious livelihoods and jobs. They include some of the poorest strata of urban citizenry who live completely on the fringes of urban society as homeless, but the bulk of them are long-term or short-term circular migrants. I think all of us know the context that between March and June 2020, we in India saw the biggest urban exodus ever in our history, and maybe in fact in global history. And I think we should first understand the root causes. Just to outline a few, the basic root causes have been the growing inequality between regions, economic as well as demographic, and between the urban and rural areas in this country over the past many decades. The growing precarity of jobs, lack of urban inclusion, which has all resulted in a growing mass of people who circulate between rural and urban areas for work. Even those who have found a foothold in urban areas live in precarity and lack access to civic citizenship. Now, they may be invisible, but they are not marginal in the sense that 60 to 70% of the urban informal workforce today consists of such migrants who are prone to be uprooted in the face of a shock. Not only the pandemic, we've seen earlier shocks also, demonetization and so on. And why do circular migrants fall in between the social protection crevices? So constitutionally, our social protection arrangements are the responsibility of all the levels of government, national, state, and local. They are invariably designed for defined jurisdictions and sedentary populations. The urban areas, the rural areas, the states, and so on, and basically people who are fixed in location. Circular migrants are by and large, by their very nature, as Divya pointed out, multi-local and translocal. They have weak citizenship rights and suffer from exclusion on broadly three grounds. One is identity. They can't prove the identities where and how it is required. Second, eligibility. They don't meet the eligibility criteria required in the particular jurisdiction. And the third is location. They're in the wrong place in terms of social protection arrangements. Therefore, and basically what is required is actions to give migrants the rights to the city. And this involves overlapping actions on part of all the levels of three levels of government, building on the recognition that the migrants have the same constitutional rights as everybody else and are a key contributor to the urban economy and wealth. And we are now realizing that many people in this country are realizing that for the first time after the pandemic, and they were rightly recognized, said that this is probably an opportunity, we should look at it in that way. So basically, I'm again stepping back, as I said, let me, basically in sort of thumbs, this thing, the broad action required at all levels of government, at the national level. And we've seen all this happen in the last 6 months, probably for the first time, but not in enough measure and not always in the right direction. So at the national level, the policies need to address growing inequality, regional inequality, inter-household inequality, interpersonal inequality, and precarity of work. A lot of policies that we have taken up in the national level, in my view, are actually doing the reverse, increasing precarity, increasing inequalities. Secondly, aim at universality of social security and portability of social protection entitlements. So the national government, when it chooses to provide a social security arrangement or a social protection arrangement, should be available to anywhere, to every citizen anywhere in the country. This is extremely important and easily possible today because of digital technologies and smart arrangements. It has to be built in and prioritized. Secondly, at the state level, states have to they have to reduce exclusionary barriers and have to address precarity. Once again, a number of state policies have actually increased exclusionary barriers. I'll refer you to the working group of migration, which was set up by the central ministry, urban poverty alleviation. And you'll see that they list a number of exclusionary barriers based on domicile, which also Divya referred to, set up by states. And of course, again, the issue of precarity, many policies which have increased rather than decreased precarity. And secondly, state governments have to create the framework for inclusive urban and urban regional planning. An example of how this can be done is, of course, the excellent presentation that we saw on Odisha. And then the urban level, and this is really the focus of this webinar. So let me just take a couple of minutes on this. I think the focus really has to be on creating inclusive cities. And when we say inclusive cities, we mean inclusive of not only all the sections of urban society, the people we classify as urban citizens, but also those who come in to work in the cities, and therefore they have a claim on urban space and urban civic life, and their rights to the city should be protected. Now, I think there are three broad sets of issues which we need to consider under this rubric. First of all, the whole issue of appropriate urban planning, access to basic infrastructure for everyone, including the migrants that I'm talking about, housing, which apparently you will be speaking of in another seminar, and social services for all. Social services means health, means education, and so on. So all these services have to be available to everyone who comes to work in the city, whether these are seasonal migrants, whether these are long-term circular migrants who live in the slums, in congested localities, in all kinds of housing arrangements, and so on. These should be available by virtue of planning. And planning should also enable that they carry out their livelihoods. You know, the vending policy, the national vendors policy was implemented in order to allow a very important group of self-employed people in the urban areas to carry out their livelihoods. So this is one basic task which urban planners, urban policy planners have to see whether, you know, to look at the adequacy of this. Secondly, basically enabling institutions and policies set in place institutions and policies which can enable stakeholder participation and contribution on an equitable manner. Once again, the example given in Odisha is an excellent example of actually aiming at an institution or using an institution, strengthening an institution, and creating a policy which can synergize stakeholder participation and contribute to the development of the city and the city space. The city that I lived in for a long time, Delhi, created an institution at one point of time, what was called they were called the gender resource centers, which did something similar, but perhaps not in exactly the same manner as the Odisha experiment. But there was also another experiment which they carried out, which was the Bhagidari experiment, which was to empower the resident welfare associations, but it empowered them to create exclusionary spaces and to privatize thousands of hectares of space for their own use. And this, of course, has happened nationally. The RWAs have across the country privatized hundreds of thousands of hectares of space and created exclusionary spaces. So one needs to look at stakeholder participation by considering the poorest, by considering the migrants who have a right to the city. Now, the urban employment guarantee is in the current context, the pandemic context, the whole area of an urban employment guarantee programs, because what has happened today is that the country is faced with an economic crisis of unprecedented proportions. Many say that it is going to be worse than the economic crisis, the Great Depression. So it is going to be for quite some time, and unemployment and underemployment are going to be endemic in rural areas and urban areas both. So an urban employment guarantee program of some kind is the right way of going about it. In 2008, the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, of which I was a part, had proposed an employment assurance program, but that was basically based on skills, imparting skills to the poor through an apprentice program. And I think now that is not sufficient. So the kind of program which is envisaged by the Odisha government, and elements of which also now similar programs are now being considered, and in fact have been put in place in Jharkhand and in Odisha and the central and in Himachal, and the central government, national government is also considering something of the kind. are extremely important to alleviate distress in urban areas. So I think these are the three broad rubrics. And I think the urban planners, the municipal bodies need to be aware that the urban spaces have to be much more inclusive. And they have to include everyone who comes and works in them. And the migrants are a very large part of those who come and work in the cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Srivastava. We would have loved to, hear more from you, because many of the things that you touched upon are absolutely great. I mean, absolutely, they make us think, because, I must confess that I was very gung-ho about the Bhagidari scheme, and you pointed out that the Bhagidari scheme actually ended up, privatizing urban spaces, much to the exclusion of the not so well endowed. So thank you for bringing this out, because this is something which I personally feel that one should have been sensitive to this, but one was not. So I'm glad that you brought this out. So the whole aspect about trying to reduce the exclusionary barriers which are set up sometimes consciously, but often sometimes unconsciously, with the best of intentions, but without a proper understanding of the ground situation, is also something that we got to consider. Now, there are some questions which I would request the panelists to address in their Q&A chat box. But if some of them still persist, we'll respond to them after Vidya has given a very brief, we've shared with you something which Sailesh Pathak shared with me early morning today, and we'll continue that discussion in the affordable housing sector also. But this is not really housing. This is really ensuring decent transit facilitation for people who first come to the city. Over to you, Vidya. Just 7 minutes to you, because
yes.
And I don't need to tell you that 2 minutes are left, but I'll just tell you to stop.
So
the disadvantages of being, sitting right next to the chair.
So I will finish before that, sir. I will be very brief, sir. Sir, before talking about this thing, I'll just say one small activity that we did in our training that we do here. So we asked our set of participants as to, let's say if you have to survive in ₹100 in a city. So how do you spend that ₹100? How do you survive on that? So they cost different activities that they will be undertaking to live the life through the day in the city. And to our surprise, one of the biggest costs which came out was shelter. Where do they spend the night or spend the whole month in the city, finding a good, safe place to stay? And that's a question which is faced by most of the migrant population which is coming. Many of them, as pointed out by Divya, and also by Professor Ravi, that they're very temporary and transient population, sometimes even coming for a day or a week and then going back. So in that respect, we do have examples of many ran baseras all around, though we do have also many people spending their night in maybe on footpath, on railway stations, etc. But we do have ran basera, but sadly the ran baseras have not been able to give a place which is full of dignity, let's say safety, and also it doesn't give you identity. Many a times I've seen that, let's say police or many people think that many of these areas are also the areas which are known for miscreants also. So how do we solve this problem? So the solution which came up was really very simple, but very, I will say, insightful. It says that, well, now we have the technology which can aid us. JAM Trinity, Aadhaar, or retinal-based identification system. So we can have well-functioning, market-driven kind of arrangement of ran basera, whereby people can come and stay. We can ensure using an authentication process that they're staying. It could be twice a night where they're being authenticated and they're staying. And if they spend the night in the ran basera, there could be a direct transfer of, let's say, we can call it a subsidy or we can call it a conditional transfer of money, which can happen directly to the person who spent the night in the ran basera. And this could be a small amount, it would not be a very big amount. It could be rupees 70 or 80 rupees, that what is being proposed. And there should be no cap on the number of people who wants to avail them, as long as they're willing or they need to spend the night in the ran basera. Part of this money can also go to the person who is running the ran basera. And it could be the rates that being charged by the person who is running the ran basera from the person who is spending the night could be market regulated. The person will choose to go to a place which is safe, which is within his budget, which meets his or her requirement. And what can happen over time is that, yes, one will provide a safe space, a space where they are able to pay, get the services. There could be some very basic minimum standards of, let's say, safety, hygiene, etc., which can be put in place. No other regulation in terms of number of beds, location, etc., because all these things can be taken care by the market. What can it also lead to, most interestingly, is that over time, we would get a very accurate picture of the number of people who are coming, where they want to live, what kind of people, and if we are looking for housing for all. Well, that is a dream which is well connected with this particular set of data, which I've also found some questions in the chat, the Q&A box about. Many people do say that we really do not know how many people, where are they, what are they doing, where do they get the data from there. So this solves that problem also. A simple idea can be done without planning a lot of data collection to begin with, and can really help people who are needy, who would need to or are forced to spend their night in the embassy. This is also.
Thank you, Vidya. I think you've summed it up very well. And what I'm going to do now is I've taken up 6 questions, and being a good administrator, I'll divide it equally amongst the 3 panelists, not giving a chance to Vidya because he's sitting right next to me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read out the questions, and I'm also going to tell who's going to address these issues. So first we'll come to Mathivanan sir. There are 2 questions. One is that many migrants are returning and have returned to the cities for employment. How is this going to be managed? What is the impact preparedness? That is, what happens when they get back to the cities from where they came? That is one. And second is that, is the labor getting back to their pre-pandemic jobs in the new normal situation? And how are you reacting to this? Because many of the people who come in from Surat and other places, are you going to keep a track of them? How are you going to be looking into those people who had come to you during the COVID times and when they're going back? And how are you going to establish that relationship? For you, Divya, there are 2 questions. One is, that what is the gendered impact of the lockdown, especially on women in the paid care workspace? And the second question for you is that what are the necessary steps to make the visible issues of women migrant workers invisible issues of women migrant workers, and how do we address them? And to you, Professor Ravi, is the 2 questions. One is that how can governments and businesses be held accountable for the conditions in which the migrant labor will be living as we go forward? And second question, which I would want you to address, is that how are institutional capacities and efficient HR going to be managed by government institutions, and how do we strengthen them? So we have exactly about 20 minutes for the 3 of you, so it's 7 minutes each. Over to you, Mathivanan.
Sir, the migrant laborers issue which we are currently facing, the large number of migrants who have come from Gujarat and the South Indian states, basically it's very difficult to match the skill sets and the opportunities available in the home state. So they are all engaged in the textile industry, they are engaged in the diamond industry, or they are engaged in other hospitality industry in those places. So giving them an alternative employment here is not possible actually. It's not, we can't create that kind of in those trades. So what we are doing is that whatever is possible in the urban areas, like the asset creation activities, we are opening up that and creating opportunities, and some of them are getting engaged and many of them are not getting engaged. That's the reality. We will not be able to match it. That challenge will continue to remain. But only thing what we are trying to do is that I am also in charge, not only that I am Principal Secretary Housing and Urban Development, I am also the COVID observer for Ganjam and Gajapati districts, which have the maximum number of migrants from the Gujarat and other places. These 2 districts together, they have about more than 4.5 lakh migrant laborers who have come in now. Though the actual numbers are more than 10 lakhs, 4.5 lakh laborers have actually, they are present here. They have already started going back in batches, and the trains special trains have already started going to Surat. But now what we are working, Ajivika also is our partner. So what we are trying to do is that we are creating a digital platform, and we are trying to register them and then create opportunities for making them entitled for various schemes, their services, to how do we they avail services, and this end, how do we this duration, how do we enhance their skill sets. If they are working in textile sector, then how do we upgrade their skill sets, how do we recognize the prior learning, give certification, and then if they are moving to Surat and other places, how do we keep track of them, where do they go, where do they live, and how they live, and then continue to have some kind of linkage. Tomorrow if there is something similar thing happens, again they are going to come back. So that kind of arrangements we are working, and this side we are working with the Gram Vikas and NGO, the other side we are working with Ajivika. So we hope that we'll come up with some exemplary model for the entire country.
I think, thank you very much. I think you raised some very important issues. And one more thing which came to my mind was that, I think it is time for the labor secretaries and employment secretaries of states also to get together, especially states which are receiving a lot of workers and states which are giving a lot of workers. For example, Bihar and Odisha, we are the ones who are sending workers, and Gujarat and Punjab and Haryana and Kerala are the ones which are receiving workers. So I think if some sort of a portal was to be developed, if some sort of a trust was to be developed, that will be very important, because you see, the migrant worker, because he does not have a voting right, because he does not have a ration card, he is an easy prey to the local, to the local intermediary, for want of a that's the most polite word that we can use. So he gets entangled with that. So if there was a helpline that he can, so what it other words means is that if a labor right is being violated of an Odia worker in Surat, there could be a zero FIR sort of a thing, there could be a labor, so he could report to you, and you could then perhaps take up the matter. So I think a good coordination between the industry departments and the labor departments is what the future ought to be. So start thinking on those lines, and with people like you there and your batchmates in industry, I'm sure we'll be able to come out with something which will be more relevant. Because you see, these days this is the sort of thing which is of absolute importance. Divya, may I request you to respond?
A small input.
Okay,
they have voting rights on both sides, sir. On both ends, they have voting rights. Whenever there is an election in Odisha, they come en masse, vote here and go, avail the benefits. And whenever election happen in Gujarat also, they vote there, sir.
Well, that is again a little constitutional anomaly. They can vote only at one place, but anyway. So that's again another issue that we need to raise. But good. I think we need to have a further discussion on that. Thank you. So over to you, Divya.
Yeah, thank
you,
sir.
For your two questions.
Sure. So I think regarding the gendered impacts of the lockdown, especially in the paid care workspace, I think there were a lot of surveys, especially in cities like Delhi, that pointed out that many domestic workers, more than 85% of domestic workers, were not paid their salaries because a lot of them stopped coming, and again, it is all informal arrangements. So there is no way for the workers also to hold the employers responsible in any way or accountable for their salaries. So I think non-payment of wage arrears exists across a lot of sectors, especially for migrant workers. But I think during the lockdown, we saw that domestic work was one area where domestic workers were really affected, in spite of retaining their employment arrangements, maybe verbally, but they were called back after many months. But during the interim period, they were not paid these arrangements. And I think this is again anecdotal that I have come across, is that there were many households who, because they did not want to bring in their domestic workers, they also went on to buy more gadgets for cleaning and cooking and all of that. And this really, again, something that a lot of labor activists have pointed out, is that displacement of labor due to the increased use of technology. So we have yet to see in the post-lockdown, post-corona phase, how much this has kind of affected the employment opportunities itself of such domestic workers. But more generally, there was a question on the invisibilization of women migrant workers and the issues that they face. In one of, again, our recent kind of research studies where we examined this issue very closely, we found that women migrant workers really have to undertake responsibilities on triple fronts. which is, they also participate very actively in the labor market. They participate as construction workers, though very bottom end, or as home-based workers or any of these, but also again, at the same time, undertaking the productive and reproductive responsibilities of a household. And they have to, because they keep on moving from one destination to another, they have to reproduce the entire household in a way, in very frugal conditions, with using very minimal kind of resources, which puts such a burden on, cognitive and physical burden on their lives. That is a real kind of concern. Not to mention other, gender-based issues like violence and sexual harassment and domestic violence, all of these, both in the workspaces. We encountered lots and lots of women who said that contractors, of course, it's not a surprise at all that contractors sexually harass them on a regular basis. And women migrants who are slightly older, maybe more than 30 or 35 years of age, find it really difficult to actually participate in the labor market, because only young women are preferred for, any kind of work like construction or small scale kind of industrial work. How do we kind of rectify this? I think one important basic thing that I also highlighted in my presentation is to improve basic urban public provisioning, because that will really reduce the burden on women migrant workers who are really, who in the absence of water or sanitation facilities that are easily accessible and dignified. I think just providing that and making that easily accessible will itself kind of reduce the burden on women migrant workers in a major way. And of course, to address the other kind of gendered issues, setting up migrant women resource centers, where women can go in the case of events like sexual harassment or domestic violence and report their kind of grievances. And police stations and other kind of frontline personnel should be made more sensitive, I think, to the issues faced by migrant workers. Again, rain baseras that Vidyaji was talking about, I think some of those also need to be made more gender friendly. At least in Ahmedabad, in our experience, it was gender segregated spaces in rain baseras. So for example, a family unit will not be able to make use of such a space because they either have to, these are separated for men and women. So being more cognizant of the heterogeneity of this population, family migration, migrants and their needs, and designing spaces in accordance with that, I think would be also very helpful.
No, good. Thank you very much, Vibha. I think these are very important and very pertinent observations. You see the triple load which a woman has to face. I mean, she is a migrant worker. She also has to do productive and reproductive work and face harassment at work and domestic violence at home, and perhaps at three places. I mean, back home in the Sasural and in the temporary shelter. So I think they're all issues which have come to the fore and which we need to address. Over to you, Professor Srivastava.
Thanks. So two big questions which require actually entire seminars and more than that to answer. One is the question of accountability, and this accountability of both government and then you said businesses. So let me begin with the easier issue of businesses. If you look at businesses, what has happened, and particularly in the context that we're discussing, as we always talk about India as being over-regulated in some senses and heavily under-regulated in many more meaningful senses. It's the same with businesses. Businesses, if you look at formal businesses, they tend to be over-regulated in many ways, but in key senses, they are under-regulated. And one result of that is that even if you just look at what we call informal jobs, precarious jobs, in the formal sector in India today, 6 out of 10 jobs are informal jobs in the formal sector of the economy. And businesses are not responsible for housing. They're not responsible for the health of these workers. They're not responsible for anything else that happens to these migrant workers, because either they're just not responsible or the burden is passed on to the contractors. And therefore, this is a very critical area. If we want to reverse the wheel, reduce precarity, and that's extremely important also for productivity and growth in this country, then the entire paradigm and the entire mindset has to change with respect to businesses. Then only can you think of making businesses responsible in any sense of the word. That's number one. As far as governments are concerned, of course, in government, we always distinguish between the political executive and the state executive, you know, the people, the state bureaucracy. And there are different levels of, you know, accountability. The broad point that I want to make is that accountability, part of accountability is always internal to the system. Better systems of accountability that are internal to the system, part of the accountability has to come from outside the system. You know, from peer, from social pressure, from social audit, and so on and so forth. And clearly, if we look at India and we see where things work well within government, and then there are areas where they don't work, they don't work very well. And we look at systems of accountability in differentiating between performance levels. I think there are many lessons to be learned. I'm sure the Academy must be at the forefront of some of this exercise. So I'm not going to speak on them in great detail. On then the second question about institutional capacity in HR, you know, the key question as far as urban governance structures are concerned is the fragmentation of the key institutions in the urban space between maintenance and development. And then within development, of course, the whole stage of fragmentation that we have between development authorities, you know, people doing water and so on and so forth. This fragmentation, which has now a 35-year-old history in this country, is what has led to basic, actually innovation of institutional capacity in the urban governance system. And this, so that the bodies, they don't have the ownership. The civic bodies don't have ownership of a lot of issues. And I think this is something which requires a lot of thinking. It's not something, I'm not saying anything new. People have been saying this since the 73rd, 74th Amendment. But this is something which is very important. If you want to sustain institutional practices in the urban areas, then we have to reintegrate systems of governance in systems of urban governance in a very significant kind of way. And these are the lessons that we can learn from all successful global urban governance experiences. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Srivastava. And you know, these are, in fact, a lot of my officer trainees who are now in the districts, they're also raising these issues. They're also raising the issues that, you know, how deliberately the state governments are not very comfortable with powerful mayors, are not powerful with municipal corporations, because they feel that, you know, I mean, there is especially in smaller states, this is a major problem, and we have to address this issue as well. And a lot of my officer trainees also say that, you know, the 73rd, 74th Amendment was made when the internet was not there, was made when the SMS and WhatsApp was not there, and when the rural roads were not existing in the country. So once you have very strong communication channels, then decentralization poses its own set of problems. But anyway, that's another debate. Gautam has been with us right from the beginning and has been a lead architect for getting this together. Maybe Gautam, you'd like to ask one or two questions, or maybe address some of the issues that have been raised so far.
No, I think, I mean, thank you for a really excellent set of presentations, particularly in going from scale to ongoing public action to broader frameworks of more macro level restructuring. I just want to actually ask both Mathivanan sir and Ravi, in a sense, the same question, because I think that one of the contexts that we're hearing now is some conversation about the possible thinking about an urban NREGA. And so you said, Mathivanan sir, you said that you feel like the Urban Wage Employment Initiative can be the starting point to imagine what an urban NREGA would look like. I'd like you to just elaborate on that, on what would that next scaling look like? What would change as the program scaled to become more like a structural social security guarantee like NREGA is? Would the scope of work have to change? Would the governance structure have to move? How would we think about, how do we move from a program that sort of come as COVID relief and think about structuring it? Because NREGA had a very long history and time to evolve. Maharashtra Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, 20 years of learning, you know, very different rural labor markets and urban labor markets. And so how do we sort of compress that learning time and take that leap towards NREGA? And Ravi, actually a very similar question to you on the relationship between universal social security and the notion of a right to work. If an urban NREGA begins thought through, then how do we kind of hold these two parallel developments? One is about a right to social security and the other is a right to, because I think universal access to social security, there is more agreement on. I think the question of thinking about a broader responsibility for the availability of employment on the state, whether it works through a guarantee or through other forms, how would we particularly balance that question of where people demand jobs, demanding jobs in the rural and the urban, how we balance those benefits taken? Some thoughts, in some sense, I'm asking both of you to respond to this possibility of thinking about a, moving NREGA out from the rural. So if Mathivathan sir, you would like to start, and then if I could ask Ravi to respond.
Yeah, this 6 months of the experience in implementing this urban wage employment initiative has given a lot of insights to us, a lot of learnings from the execution. So one thing is that there is a need for a permanent urban wage employment program. There is a need. We realize that there is a need for it. There is a demand for it. And even after the lockdown is lifted, the economic activities are coming back to normal. This need will, we forecast that the need will continue. Maybe the scale may reduce, but the need will definitely continue. So we are planning to convert this into a permanent program. I'm working on it, number one. Number two is that we want to learn from the experiences. We want to do deep diving into the insight into this. So we are commissioning a rapid study of the implementation of the program, a third-party study, and with structured questionnaire to find out that which are the aspects which worked very well, where the things did not go as we expected. So where the contractors have come through backdoor and grabbed some of the orders. So majority, we know that the self-help groups and the community-based institutions are doing, but there could be some cases where these institutions are weak. The contractors might have, managed to come in. So we wanted to understand that where these community institutions have really kind of, got into the job and executed the work, where the contractors have camouflaged somehow. So, and these things will help us to frame the template of the new version, new avatar. And I'm sure maybe in another 2-3 months, we are very fast in Odisha, 2-3 months, we will come up with a full-fledged program, a wage employment program. And another thing that this also has enhanced the community ownership into the work and the assets. So they had a say in the select of the location of the asset, where they want to have a community center, where they want to have a park, which work to be taken up. We realize that they have started asserting, and now they are our official implementing partner. That contractor nexus has been broken to a large extent. So now we want to extend this framework for executing all work, majority of the works. If you are constructing the interstate bus terminal or a big highway and all, though, okay, that's okay. You go for the tender and implement in the regular way. But all these community-based assets, which are in the neighborhood, these things do not need high-end contractors. Basically, you engage mestris and skilled manpower, semi-skilled manpower, and you supervise the work and get it done. And the role of municipal engineers also is very vital in that. So with that setup, I think with community partnership, we'll be able to execute 80% of the works, 80% of the developmental works happening in the urban local bodies. So we want to make that as a norm post-COVID.
You see, there's a little problem here. The issue is that you are addressing people who are permanently living in the urban areas. So, slum dwellers are again permanent. Now, our issue, I'm not saying that the work that is done is not very great, but the point is that you, as you said, were the COVID in charge for the districts of Ganjam and the Ganjam, you said you were the... Now, what happens to the workers? You see, because all your efforts have moved into the urban areas, whereas these people have come back from the urban into the rural hinterland. So that's where, we need to perhaps think this through at a much deeper level, because we're not really looking at it's a larger issue. So one is not saying that NREGA, see, in fact, the expansion of NREGA is because the hinterland, the people who are the larger number of people are moving from rural areas. As was pointed out by Divya, they are the marginals in the rural who are becoming the new informals in the urban. But our solution is to look, our solution that you are suggesting and proposing is for those who are permanent slum dwellers in an urban area, because they are the ones who can make their slums work better and the slum bastis work better. But this is a much larger question to which I don't have an answer. And if you have an answer, I'll be very glad to hear that. But over to you, Professor Srivastava.
Thanks a lot. So I'll just, Gautam, take you through a little bit of the thought process that we put in many years ago in the NCUS in designing and proposing the employment assurance scheme for the urban areas, which I probably was the first structured proposal for a urban employment guarantee program. Now, the thought process that we put in was that, number one, it should be in budgetary terms, in subsidy terms, no different from the rural program. So we said, at that point of time, 100 days of work, so 10,000 rupees in an urban area per household, 10,000 rupees in the rural areas. No distinction between the two. In the urban areas at that point of time, we said it should be a skill-oriented program for school dropouts, a kind of an apprenticeship cum skill development program. But of course, the emphasis now on public works of the kind that has been described in the Odisha program is absolutely right, because we need a much bigger program just now. Our rationale for proposing something which basically the same wage rate and the same budget per household at that point of time was that we didn't really want to get into questions of eligibility and of residence and so on, assuming that a person would always want employment near where he or she lives. But at the same time, there could be temporary episodes where people would like to have employment in the place where they temporarily were located. Maybe a migrant stuck in Surat would like to be employed temporarily in Surat and so on. So therefore, we basically, our distinguishing feature was that if you have the same level of subsidy and the same level of assurance, then we should not really worry about who is taking up these programs, or rather where they're taking up these programs. So it is in that context, I think we should look at to also answer your question. The broad framework should not be one where we worry too much about where the uptake is or who takes up these programs. But at the same time, we should of course worry about distortions. Though just one more this thing, as far as the Odisha program is concerned, the Odisha institutions are still very new. They're not like the Kerala institutions right now. We don't have 20 years of history behind them. But so we'll have to see how they work and they absorb the program. But these programs are still micro programs. 1 lakh rupees worth of public programs, even if totally invested in wages at the current Manrega levels, will generate 500 work days of employment. So 5 days for 5 people for 100 days. They're very small at the moment. But of course, multiplied in terms of the number of projects and across the destination and across the cities. In that sense, they're very important. So I think they're very important very important to see how they will evolve over the next few period. But I particularly I'm not interested in putting too many domiciliary requirements on an employment program of this kind, noting that people will work where they live mostly, noting also that ultimately it's a question of directing a subsidy to generate some limited amount of employment.
I'm struck very.
So thank you. Okay. Yes, Gautam, you want to say the last 30 seconds?
Just 15. I said I'm struck very much by the debates on the universalization of PDS and precisely the question on thinking about underemphasizing the where and really using the robust technical and other infrastructures to sort of anticipate multi-locality, like Divya would say. And I think that if we begin with anticipating that in modern 21st century urban India, multi-local lives will be the dominant form. It will sort of make migration not the exception. And so I think our systems have to rise to that universal challenge and accept certain kinds of errors and live with them, but not accept other exclusions. It goes back to that older idea of a universal with a type 1 error versus a universal with a type 2 error. So I think that's very thoughtful. Over to you, sir.
No, thank you very much. I think we've had one of the most stimulating webinars that I have attended in the last 6 months. And let me assure you that we are doing these webinars very often. The subject was very clear. The panelists were absolutely focused. Several questions have been raised, several answers. I mean, we are moving towards several answers, because I think the best part about a debate is that intelligent questions are raised, because once those questions are raised, then we'll be able to get around them. So with these few words, let me thank Madhivanan for a very, very good initiative. A very, very good initiative. Now, you see, if we say that there can be improvements or something, or issues about scale, that is not to underestimate what you've done, because the first time, because what you've done is something like what happened in the EGS in Maharashtra in the late 60s. Right? So Maharashtra, EGS and horticulture. In fact, EGS and horticulture in Maharashtra have today transformed the nation, in the sense that today there is more horticulture than cereals in terms of weight, volume and value. And that steps back to 60s. So we don't know what is the larger positive outcome of what you've done. So congratulations, the Academy is very proud of you. Thank you very much, Divya. You've raised some very, very fundamental questions, and you've got our minds to think about, especially about the vulnerability of women and how we can address those issues. It's not that we're going to find an answer day after tomorrow, but all of us will start thinking about it, and it'll put us on the right track. And going on the right track is far more important than even reaching the destination, because you can reach the destination only when you're on the right track. So thank you, Divya, for that. And thank you very much, Professor Srivastava, for bringing in the overall architecture, bringing in the overall ecosystem for all these things. I mean, for putting a very inclusive framework. And I'm sure we'll be able to work together on these things. And thank you, Gautam, for being a great anchor, for being a great support, and for stitching this all together. And last but not the least, Vidya, who's actually Vidya Bhushan, and I'm very privileged to have him as my colleague. And thank you also to Ajay, who's managing our technology frontier. Say hi, Ajay. Just say hi and show your face to everyone. We couldn't have done this without you. So thank you very much, friends. I see you, Ajay. Say hello.
Hello, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
We'll be happy to answer any questions if you send them to us by mail also, in case we've not been able to.
Sure.
So we'll send the questions on email to all the participants, and they can respond.
And then you can just collect them and send them out. Yeah.
Sir, and thank you, Swastik and HS team over there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
We need you back for the housing webinar on the 25th. That will be great.
Thanks, Gautam.
Thank you.